think we can start. Good evening. My name is Enoch Chen. I'm the program manager of Asia Arts Archive. For those of you who are new to the archive, we are a non-profit art organization in Hong Kong dedicated to the documentation of the development of contemporary Asian art. We have a library upstairs. We have now cataloged over 35,000 items, material, and we're open to the public. So please feel free to come Monday to Saturday, 10 to 6. So instead of being an archive waiting to be discovered, we actively organize different kinds of events and programs, such as the event tonight that we very happily co-present with Parasites. The event tonight, there are two parts. So the first part takes place here, which is an hour talk. It's entitled Above and Beyond. And so we will look at two specific exhibitions, Camping and Tramping through the Colonial Archive, the museum in Malaya, and Prep Room, things that may or may not happen. And we will look at the curatorial method in the sense of in the sense of playing with the archival material. And then from 8 to 9, we will go to Parasite, where there will be a screening session looking at the Malay black and white archive. Malaya black and white archive, which is just right across the street. And just a quick word, quick background about our speaker tonight, Shabbir Hussain Mustafa. He is the curator of NUS Museum, the National University of Singapore. And his research interests are in modern Southeast Asian history within the broader framework of archival curatorial method being developed at the NUS Museum. His approach has centered heavily on deploying archival texts, exploiting engaging different modes of thinking and writing, all in an attempt to open up the archive to multiple struggles of perception and reading. And tonight I'd like to especially thank you for coming, and we'd like to thank Chinyi, and also especially Parasite, and also the program, because the reason why Mustafa is here is because of the Parasite initiative called the PS.RESIDENCY, Parasite International Art Residency. This is a multi-center program with a continuous address is in artist home base, an initiative of Hong Kong Art Center in the historical site right up there. And they have been developing different kinds of programs and long-term dialogue and collaboration, also spring workshop. So without further ado, now hand over the time to Mustafa. Thank you.
Thanks, Enoch. Should I use this?
Yes.
What do you suggest I do that? Thanks for the introduction. And I just want to begin by thanking...
Take closer to the microphone.
Oh. Just want to begin by thanking Parasite. Maybe I have some kind of... Oh, okay, it's working. Neutral. Great. Oh, it's okay, okay, sorry. Just want to begin by thanking Parasite for having me here, and the Asia Art Archive for so gladly willing to host this talk. It's really a privilege, and I want to thank everybody in the audience for coming down on a Thursday evening. What I'll do today is I'll speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how things go. I have quite a few slides, and I'm quite excited to share some of these ideas with you. Let me just guide you through. The presentation itself is divided up into 3 sections. I'll begin a little bit by talking about the kind of institutional context that some of these projects were developed in, and I tend to emphasize on this because at the end of the day, I suppose the kind of institution that one works in also gears one's practice. And then I'll sort of go into the body of the presentation itself, where I talk about how this turn towards the archive actually occurred and how one chances upon some of these findings from time to time. And then eventually, which is why I'll also discuss the Camping and Tramping exhibition. I also have a catalog here which can be circulated, and please feel free to flip through it. And eventually I'll end with this project called the Prep Room, Things That May or May Not Happen, which is kind of this, it's a zone that we've set up within the museum where we work with different researchers to develop exhibitions for the future. So here goes. I'm going to read through certain sections of my presentation, so please bear with me, and then of course I'll speak off the cuff for some. Let me just begin. Established around the mid-1950s, before Singapore's independence, the NUS Museum may be regarded as a prototypal institution. The passage through decolonization, simultaneous formation of newly independent states across former British colonies, and the emergent experience of modernity in its disruptive, tumultuous, and transformative forms provided a context to the museum's establishment and development. This talk revisits the issues surrounding the formation of the NUS Museum in the mid-1950s, not as an explication of history, but rather as a critique on contemporary museological practices in Singapore, primarily in relation to NUS Museum's conditions and situations today. Thereafter, following a discussion on a number of projects which had been launched since 2007, the paper also goes on to offer tentative perspectives into two particular projects, namely Camping and Tramping and Prep Room. The NUS Museum's collection today is diverse, ranging The NUS Museum's collection today is diverse, ranging from classical Chinese and Indian materials to modern and contemporary Southeast Asian art. Initiated in 1955 by its first curator, Michael Sullivan, it was first introduced as a teaching collection. Among the museum's original aims were to create a center, and I'm quoting Michael Sullivan here, a center for the study and enjoyment of art, close quote, to complement an art history program, to facilitate, open quote, research into the art and archaeology of Southeast Asia, and to gather a representative collection of art of those civilizations that have chiefly contributed to the creation of a Malayan culture. Since 1955, contingent on the developments of Singapore and the university, and of course the different curators who came after him, the museum and its collection underwent a series of changes. One of the most significant events included the division of the collection across national lines when the University of Malaya was established in Kuala Lumpur in the early 1960s. Broadly then, my talk today sets out the following questions. How does a museum, encumbered by its commitment to its collection and perceived universal role, respond to these situations? On the one hand, encouraged by the prospects, but on the other, observant of the expectations. In charting newer roles and directions, how does it reconcile or reevaluate its fundamental mission with the other broader aims of the university and the fraternity of museums, whether they may be complementary or contrasting? How may the museum meaningfully participate as a partner in the ongoing structural changes, rather than simply being a derivative of change? How about the possibility of an open-ended system that sustains a negotiation between museum, practice, and a critical body of discourses, holding the museum's agenda simultaneously provisionary and evolving, constantly informed by new ways of approaching and reading material history and visual culture? And of course, I think in the context of today's conversation, what has all of this got to do with the Colonial Archive? Within the museum, based on the collections that we have, the diagram that you're looking at here, the museum itself is separated into 3 floors. Some of you have already been there, but for those who have not, the first section, which is actually called the Li Kongxian collection, is primarily a Chinese collection, which contains antiquities and all the way to Chinese contemporary art. The second floor, which is sort of administratively and collectively referred to as the South and Southeast Asian collection, houses, as I told you before, stuff like classical Indian sculpture to, again, contemporary South and Southeast Asian art. The third floor is the Ang Teng collection, who was a modern sculptor in Singapore, and eventually, little before his passing, he donated close to 1,000 objects to the museum, and it's formed a pretty significant aspect of our outreach efforts. But what I want to emphasize here is not simply the collections as they're divided across the 3 floors, but what I want to talk about here is the kind of temporary exhibitions and the archival displays that we generate as a result of it. So the idea is that more often than not, the temporary exhibitions will always be in conversation with the permanent collections. And of course, all of these are further layered by this notion of the prep room, which can be used collectively to sort of suggest and intimate future exhibitions. So today, just to get things off the ground, I'll be talking about a series of projects. The first, of course, is Fragments, Histories, Context, the NUS Museum South Asian Collection, which is a project that happened in 2007. And then another project on craft communities in India, and then looking at some of the temporary exhibitions that we developed, some of the earlier ones. One looking at this kind of a relationship between how archives are formed with desire, and it sort of unraveled the story of this one particular artist whom I've been studying for a number of years now. And of course, I Polunin was another sort of an archival exhibition looking at the history of photography, I suppose, a part history of photography in Singapore, and Persistent Visions Arikatan, which is a contemporary art exhibition. And then I'll quickly go on to talk about these 3 shows, which is of course the core. There are some other contemporary art exhibitions that we've also developed, which have sort of spun off from the Camping and Tramping project, but I won't be touching on them today, partly also because Parasite is holding a conference and I'll be actually talking about it at that point. Okay. Let me quickly talk about this first show. The earliest endeavor in reconstituting parts of the NUS Museum's permanent collection began in 2007 as part of a project titled Fragments, Histories, Context, the NUS Museum South Asian Collection. Locating the initial tenets of the NUS Museum's collection, the exhibition sought to understand the politics of representation potentiated through a 1955 donation of Indian art objects by the Indian government to a newly self-governing Singapore. The approach to the exhibition was one of enabling the audience to gain an insight into the politics of post-colonial gift-giving in an era when notions of the third world were being increasingly bandied about. Emerging from similar yet different experiences of colonial rule, the post-colonial gift, of course potentiated through a number of objects, ranged from Gandharan sculptures to Mughal miniatures to Indian progressive painters such as M.F. Hussain. The exhibition sought to elicit questions of how indeed objects could be represented or displayed in the context of a museum. The broader processes which encumbered the revisiting of the 1959 episode enabled a certain opening up and interrogation of the NUS Museum's own history, notably how the constitution of subjects operates in changing exhibitionary complexes and how notions of citizenship come to be addressed, of course constantly problematized and disturbed. The neutrality of the objects as harbingers of evolutionary civilizational accomplishment was consciously underplayed in this exhibition. The site itself was declared as a non-neutral and, of course, the gallery subject to shifting meanings. More than the archaeological claims that the objects were said to represent, it was their invocation in the post-colonial era that led to the remaking, if not relayering, of history. The challenge of representation and display then revolved largely around the type and scope of history that such stone relics, along with the other artworks, could be made to tell. So in some ways, we constantly and quite consciously undermined the role of art history in reading objects and sort of brought back this notion of context, curatorially speaking at least. The interrogation of the NUS Museum's history continued with another project which retraced a 1964 expedition undertaken to study and collect Indian textiles by of course, William Willets, the reputed art historian and director of the University of Malaya Art Museum from 1961 to 1970. Willets, of course, was a crucial figure in the division of the university's art collection in 1966, with the other half of the collection now residing in Kuala Lumpur, as I mentioned earlier, at the University of Malaya Museum. Coming back to the 1964 trip, the collecting trip was juxtaposed to a more recent trip taken by a group of students from the university's Scholars Program at NUS to study the challenges faced by artisan communities who live and work in North and Western India. Curatorially, the project was challenging. Juxtapositions of a tenuous and contested past against contemporary modes of production and gazing was neither neutral nor unambiguous. In the midst of forging this kind of, this reparative kind of continuity between cultural identity and the historical past, the project had to contend with two other caveats. Once again, like the 1959 episode, the museum space itself accentuated some of the inherent difficulties in reconciling the ever-shifting terrain between museums and their source communities. More discerningly, the biggest challenge was to push beyond the discipline of art history and into a sort of a multidisciplinary method of rendering art and interrogating material culture. The postulation of the two episodes, 1964 and 2008 respectively, very much like the various discursive elements that will be discussed in the current talk today, remain crucial in illustrating the discrepancy between the finitude of the thinking rational body of literature and infinite variety of the world, which always remains in excess of what the modern episteme can or does represent. So in many ways, the idea was to allude that there is something happening outside the museum's walls, and there is something that we're trying to access. Of course, to what extent, we're not very sure. After the two exhibitions, what had also become curatorially endearing was this. To be a nation was to be endowed with a sense of patrimony over one's sense of culture and being. With the possibility of nationhood looming large in 1950s Malaya, the museum and those who composed it sought a syntax of reform, going back to Michael Sullivan. They even sought a remapping of culture, a vision for producing Malaya as a people who were capable of embracing traditions and scientific knowledge for their own sake. With, of course, ideological imagination and dexterity, Michael Sullivan had begun the University of Malaya Museum, arguing that a Malayan modernity must be irreducibly different, as the configuration of its territory must be indicative of its unique heritage. Sullivan envisioned Malaya as a focal point about which were ranged several of the major civilizations of the world, including China and India. And of course, as the University Museum had evolved, it had quoted donations, it came to represent this kind of a multivalent sign, traversing a vast arena of academic disciplines, but also as an indicator of how the politics of non-alignment and the post-colonial state would penetrate the fabric of social life in a newly independent Malaya. We will return to this statement all throughout tonight. First, in terms of how the curatorial method today may be conceived, and later how particular notions may be deployed within the gallery. The first attempt at interrogating the discursive vis-à-vis the material was part of a project titled Archives and Desires, Selections from the Mohammedan Moment Collection, and the exhibition happened in 2008. The exhibition itself evolved from a request made by Hamida Jalil to the NUS Museum in late 2007 to make sense of a late husband's collection of paintings, sketches, and artifacts. Mohammedan was a painter and sculptor trained at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. However, what made him distinct was his engagement with nature, which extended from his practice as a traditional healer. As such, Mohammedan's works operated as amulets with talismanic and healing potentials, composed in specific ways with particular attention to the requirements of his user in mind. Therefore, the display strategy had to be accordingly devised to make the reader examine and experience Mohammedan's objects within a sort of a vacuum. The various floral elements juxtaposed alongside the wooden chests and cabinets, all hovered over by his sculptures and paintings, attempted to create a fluid space, where the different elements interacted with each other in the hope of producing an aesthetic which remained representative of Mohammedan's oeuvre, all the while acknowledging the artificiality represented by the museum and its taxonomic conventions. The approach to the archive was not just to capture this modernist duality between the rational and not so rational, or between what constituted science and what potentiated magic, but as a critique which sought to lodge itself in between such a dialectical space generated when objects define museological taxonomic classifications, and of course in Mohammadin's case, collected with a seemingly emotional intent, are forced to enter an implicit archival process before they can be exhibited within the museum. As such, conflating and merging of the two terms, archives and desires, principally attempted to capture the different complexities and assumptions involved in what constitutes an institutionalized archival collection of art and artifact, which obviously are collected along taxonomic norms, and what forms a private collection based on a radically different worldview. So, in some ways, I spent close to a year documenting Muhammad's house in Singapore. It's a 2-bedroom apartment. It's not something very fancy. It's in the public housing estate. And when I went in, I sort of soon realized that I was here to document his paintings, but it was very difficult to differentiate between what he had collected and what he had painted. And so in many ways, the exhibition kind of tried to blur these distinctions. So everything sort of became this sort of a curatorial ploy almost in generating Muhammadin and what his life meant. So for instance, his mirror also became part of the artifact, or kind of part of the presentation, because he would collect objects which he believed had a certain inherent meaning. He was of course a very accomplished calligrapher as well. So for instance, like these chests which he would have in his home, it contained, for instance, if you look closer, it actually contains his whole Singapore driving license as well, which we showed along with the other objects. The experimentations of archives and desires were then extended in 2009 in a much larger exhibition which surveyed everyday life in Singapore and then Malaya during the decolonization years of the 1950s. I. Polunin, Memories of Singapore Through Film and Photographs, presented selections from the personal archives of Dr. Ivan Polunin, whose interest in the natural sciences and medicine brought him to Malaya from England in 1948, after which he joined the Department of Social Medicine and Public Health at the then University of Malaya. He eventually retired as Associate Professor from the National University of Singapore in December 1980. Conceptualized again as an archival site, the exhibition brought together Dr. Polunin's personal objects. Dr. Polunin's personal objects, which sat alongside the film projections and photographic displays, encouraging its audiences to connect intuitively. I. Polunin strove to challenge taken for granted notions of memory and nostalgia in the post-colonial experience of nation building. In many ways, the exhibition alluded to the therapeutic potentials of recalling memories of the Singapore past, all in an attempt at making sense of a modern conscious Singapore existence today. Yet in order to fully grasp the geographical and historical terrain that Dr. Polunin's materials occupy, the reader was invited to recognize how Singapore, and then Malaya, also helped to define him as its contrasting image, idea, personality. As such, the emphasis on I in I. Polunin remained significant. The display of his materials and life dramatically shifted and continuously oscillated the locus of the gaze from Malayan exotica and his species to Dr. Polunin as a passionate scholar, and more so as a figure who preserved what some may call a national treasure, which could now, of course, be made available to further study. The reception of I. Polunin seemed mixed at best. The narratival approach, which remains self-conscious of the other as a construct, which emerges from within the enunciations of a sort of post and colonial discourse, seemed displaced into a particularized form of nostalgia of a Singapore lost, of times and places which demand reclamation from images as if to negotiate a particular cultural and political authority. The strategy that was devised to subvert such an appeal was by the introduction of Erika Tan's Persistent Visions, a 24-minute 3-screen installation which engaged the concept of the Colonial Archive as a site of contestation and power. drawing upon amateur audio and visual materials collected by individuals and families attached to various British colonizing missions in the early 20th century, now deposited at the British Empire and Commonwealth Museum, the installation primarily sought to understand how imaginations of the Orient came to be, approaching the concept of the archive as a subject rather than as a source from which a greater history could emerge. Persistent Visions paid attention to the process of archiving itself, and not just the treatment of the archive as a mere receptacle of fact, voices, and memories. Within the museum itself, the artwork was strategically placed, i.e. at what we loosely call the archival square. It was actually Chinese brainchild, so maybe you can direct questions to her. A gallery sandwiched between a permanent display of predominantly Chinese bronzes, ceramics, and jade artifacts ranging from the Han to the Qing eras, and a temporary exhibition gallery which largely presents East Asian modern and contemporary art. In responding to the invitation to show persistent visions within such a spatial makeup, Erika Tan, the artist, actually reflected. So basically this is the site, and it was a 3-screen installation, and you have all these kind of archaeological fragments surrounding it. And of course the objects themselves belong to an archaeologist from Singapore called John Mixick. He's an extremely reputed figure, and he's going to be his sole figure in terms of trying to understand Singapore, especially archaeologically. And this is how Erika responded. That an artwork has the potential to intervene, possibly disrupt, call to question, or make counterclaims to receive narratives, to read fiction, is something that I see as an underlying basis or intent of much of my practice. How successful it is at doing this is another matter, exclamation mark. But what is of interest here is the invitation or the putting to work of persistent visions by curators within the institution itself. What does this say about the institution? Does the work become institutionalized critique, sanctioned by the museum to show its openness for diverse opinions and perspectives? Or is this an engagement for mutual dialogue between museum and work? The current opportunity to show the work bang smack in the midst of Chinese ceramics, etc., will, I hope, emphasize something about the work that might have been lost in other more white cubes showings. Here I hope that the fact that it mumbles, stutters, and fails to inform definitively will not only affect its own reception, but call into question the rational reflexivity have become a crucial marker of curation. The archive was becoming a strategy, and at times even an end, to generate multitudinous sort of post-colonial histories. The museum was persistently perched as a perplexing ambit, that discursive space which could be strategically deployed in enabling an engagement with its university audiences and of course the broader public. The museum as an approach, it enabled a range of publics to wander and discourse. In its ideal form, a heteroscopic space, as metaphors of the past may be recovered, interrogated, presented, and most importantly, contested, leading to a series of queries. Considering the above questions, the NUS Museum launched in 2011 the exhibition Camping and Tramping through the Colonial Archive, the museum in Malaya. A 2-year-long project that brings together objects from 2 colonial collections, namely the Raffles Museum and the University of Malaya Museum, which I've already spoken about, with the hope. The Raffles Museum was the first colonial museum to be set up in Singapore. Of course, the exact date of its establishment is contested because it's established as a library first in the 1840s, but then subsequently consolidated as a museum in 1874. So, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call it the Raffles Museum. Reconsidering not just the museum, but a series of institutions and structures in which the lives of its people were and continue to be enmeshed, forming a sort of a grid as a series of social memories brought together, or alluded to at least, within the museological space as a coherent diffusion of power and identity underpinned by the multifarious habitations of modernity we refer to as Singapore. The museological space including the texts and objects, were presented as a complex volume in which multifarious zones were deployed and differentiated. whilst the specificities of such a project did not mean to be superimposed with positivistic renderings of the historical document or monument, but rather the hope was to generate modes of seeing, which render mythical books of history, wonder, and modes of individual recordings. We included figures like Ivan Polunin and Mohammed in this exhibition as well, translate particular times and places into a dense system of practices. Or as Michel Foucault would have it, into systems that establish statements as events within their own conditions and domains of presence, and things with their own possibility and fields of use. The emergence of such traces and flows of statements lodged between the document and artifact was proposed as Camping and Tramping through the Colonial Archive. So, in many ways, I'll show you some images of the exhibition itself in a little while, but it was divided up conceptually into three parts. On your extreme left, what you have is the museum as idea. Now, the museum as idea contained numerous elements. You saw the previous stack of texts. These were 40 binders that were put together, trying to bring together different archival traces, starting from the 19th century onwards. Of course, we also included things in a slightly playful manner as well sometimes, because whilst there were things like colonial exhibitions and documents related to museology in Singapore, we also included this special section called Wonder, Magic, Superstition. Because in many ways what was happening in the 19th century in Malaya at least, and I suppose this was quite true in other parts of the empire, a lot of those associated with the Raffles Museum were also very much keen on understanding what wonder and magic was, and they went about documenting this. And there were these things that sort of seeped into the institution of the museum itself. And the early curators struggled to deal with this, you see, because for once, one could not create a category instantly and sort of locate objects within that. But of course, the struggle to create these categories in itself created all these texts and this notion to try and survey what was happening in Malaya. And so we played with this. The center was this kind of a spine where we inverted this notion of the self and other. And it began with one of the earliest objects that you can find, which is this kind of a large Malayan giant frog inside a alcohol jar, and at the bottom there is no documentation. All it says is collected before 1874. And so of course 1874 was this marking point in many ways of at least within museology in Singapore. And the third section, which was called accumulations, was the most chaotic. It was consciously chaotic, where we included objects in a sort of a chronology, at least as far as the museum was concerned. But we intervened by deploying objects which belong to Mohammed, for instance. Because Mohammed was dealing with this notion of magic and wonder and things like that, you see. And of course, the presence of a figure like Mohammed within the space tends to complicate that experience, at least of the audience. And then we further elaborated and in many ways enriched the entire experience by including 5 other films by Ivan Polunin, looking at, of course, colonial Malaya. So for instance, what you see here is the central spine, where objects were placed partly in a sort of a chronological format, but also sort of suggesting certain technologies that were operating. In the background, you see a sculpture by Mohammed, which is called Healing Bones. And so in many ways, the contemporary art intervened into the ethnographic and the natural history specimens. And this is broadly the layout. And in the background, again, you can see Ivan Polunin's films, and of course a painting by Mohammed, which is aptly titled Talking About Birds. He was kind of referencing his 19th century manuscript. And all these things are sort of elaborated within the space itself. I mean, the problem with static images sometimes is that they are unable to sort of convey some of the nuances, so I apologize for this. So again, here you can see this long line of text. It's a document that we also discovered in the archive. It's called it's a transcript by the first director, I suppose, of the Raffles Museum, And it's a lecture transcript which is titled "Museums that collect their commercial and scientific significance." And of course, he talks and says that the Raffles Museum cannot be a cabinet of curiosities, and that it has a sort of economic imperative. And again, here what you see is a film by Ivan Polunin looking at the birthday celebrations of the Sultan of Kelantan from the 1950s. Kelantan is a northern state in Malaysia. And of course, objects which were collected by Muhammad bin Muhammad himself. And so, you can see the spears, they were not presented in sort of a straight format, they were kind of undulating and sort of suggesting that something here is not right. These are some film stills from Ivan's films.
Sorry, can you describe just a little bit what happened in the film?
In the films? Okay, so we used 5 films. Mostly they were selected, they were all rushes, there is no narrative in there. And it's only a case of Ivan Polunin who returned back to his film in the 80s. And he sort of did this voice-over. So he's coming back to the films when he was digitizing them from his 16mm color film player. He's sort of describing what's happening in the film, almost this, the context behind it. So all these things are there. So you can hear Ivan's voice, but of course it's done in the 90s. And so there are things he's forgotten, things which, he's reading in which may not have originally been there. So the 5 films kind of alluded to some of these changes as well within the landscape, because in many ways, some of the everyday objects, for instance, that were used, like the knives, which were from the ethnographic collection of the Raffles Museum, were also sort of being used in these films. See, I mean, how objects would enter physiological context, and how did the ethnographic object itself start? I mean, where did the idea of the artifact itself emerge? And so these were all kind of these conjectural films that were introduced, and they were meant to incite more than kind of elaborate. So for instance, the first one is from, he had done some filming of the Samai people, which are in Cameron Highlands, which is again on the peninsula, on the Malaysian peninsula. And then the second film, the 4 stills you see there, is actually the best. It's how the exhibition ends. It's called Jungle Survival, How to Save Your Life. And it was, he was commissioned by the Royal Air Force, and then he sort of produced this film. And in the film, it's hilarious, because when I was sitting down with him and talking to him, he would say that, this is the funniest film I've ever made. And I said, why? Why is that? He said, no, the Air Force personnel were told to perform these survival routines, and they found it very funny. And I said, but why? Survival? He said, yeah, exactly. It's that kind of the playfulness that is. He was engaging with.
Sorry.
Sorry?
And the other one, the last.
The last one. Oh, the last one is, as I said earlier, this is the Sultan of Kelantan and his birthday. And of course, the film is quite amazing, because the first image actually shows a medicine man blessing the food before people consume it. Of course, there are local Malay terms, for instance, pawang, gomo, whatever. And then, of course, the second is Sultan arriving. And then the third image shows this kind of a martial art form, which is very performative, and it's something that Mohammedan used to practice as well. He was a national coach for the Silat, which is. And then the last image shows some of the British colonial officers who were attending the ceremony, and they had this kind of a dance afterwards. And Ivan was there, documenting this. Some of it, of course, he was commissioned. And so these things were all placed within the site, you see, kind of as incitements to discourse in ways. And of course, there was also this conscious thing that we played with, which was this tension that exists between science and magic. And so within the space, along with those footnotes and things like that, there was also these quotations from Ivan and Mohammedan disrupting the museum's narrative. So for instance, this quote here where Mohammedan in 2004 authored this document which was called Malay Culture and Art, and he said the Malays believe that calligraphy is divine and talismanic. And of course it was juxtaposed alongside, this is the lecture transcript that I spoke about, which became a sort of a very crucial component of the exhibition itself. where James Collins talks about this notion of without questioning, no investigation, without investigation, no truth, without truth, no science. So there is this thing that was being propositioned. So again here, this is the last section in the accumulations, the top image, where you can see within the vitrines, of course, were objects that were from the University of Malaya Art Museum, the second Colonial Museum within Singapore only. And the paintings, of course, from the collection, the textiles, it was different mediums. But in the center, again, you have an artwork by Mohammed, which is called the Soul Searching Vehicle. And of course, you know, he did it in this kind of notion of trying to celebrate the nation, but it's if you can see, those are mostly all recovered objects from all over Southeast Asia, and there were heads of different sizes and colors, and they're on this sort of a bandwagon, and they're going somewhere, and you don't really know if they're going to fall off the cliff or they're going to fly away. So it's that kind of suggestion. So I'm just going to read one paragraph before about camping and tramping. Which one should I? The attempt here was to also trace an epistemological shift between a Europe as absolute and organic and the encounter with Malayan objects, a category which museum practitioners continue to struggle with today. At the same time, it can be tempting to see the instances discussed above as the price European science had to pay for its forays with non-Western objects. Indeed, even extending the views of authors who pose a particular reservation, implying that the imposition of European discourses in the colonies led to a particular perversion of the native object. Perhaps a more productive method at reconciling this would be to understand the colonial encounter as a representation, which emerged hand in hand with the native, first taking form in the Renaissance Cabinet of Curiosities, and later manifested as a microcosm of the burgeoning colonial networks of bodies and knowledge in the region, playing out, of course, in colonial exhibitions and its museums. For the contemporary practitioner, this enables not just a recognition that both the colonizer and colonized were stuck, almost, in a dialectic, now to be somehow set straight, but a more nuanced understanding of how colonial binarisms operated in difference, as Homi Bhabha would have it, enabling one to track shifts in the operation, deployment, and eventual manifestation of colonial knowledge and the idea of the museum itself. So in many ways, there was a certain kind of a recognition that emerged that this was not simply a building, this was an idea that we were sort of trying to develop curatorially at least. I know it's very self-indulgent. And I want to talk a little bit about this accompanying project with Camping and Tramping. It was called the Sufi and the Bearded Man, Remembering a Kramat in Singapore. Kramat is translated as shrine, I suppose. The closest definition would be. And it began with a request made by a PhD candidate, Taranjit Sivir, who is now finishing up his PhD at UCLA. And he approached the museum one day saying that there was this 19th century shrine in the eastern part of Singapore that was going to be torn down. And what could the museum, for instance, do about this? And of course, instantly, we didn't have any answers. No? I mean, we're a university museum, most of the time, resources are severely constrained and whatnot. But we went down, and we started spending time with the people at the shrine, trying to document the kinds of oral histories of the site itself. I mean, the site was a shrine for a 19th century Sufi who had come to Singapore through Baghdad, of course, through those kinds of networks that had already been in place. And when we started documenting it, we also realized two things. First of all, that there's a certain notion of orality that the museum had not been able to access in Camping and Tramping, because a lot of histories, I suppose, in Southeast Asia have also been transmitted orally. And that's something that more often than not museums tend to overlook, because how does one represent these oral narratives within a setting. And second of all, we went in thinking that we were going to study the shrine itself and the site, but the more we went there, we realized that we were actually talking more to the people who came there. And then, of course, there was this dilemma, and there was no idea that there was going to be an exhibition, but this is what happened. Of course, we'd find all these interesting quotes. For instance, our primary collaborator was Waq Ali Jangut, Ali Jangut, of course, Jangut means the bearded one. And hence the title of the show. The Sufi, of course, referencing the saint who was buried there, and of course the bearded one who was the caretaker. And here he would say, you see, we are nobodies, but once this area was majestic. We must tell these histories, the stories of tradition that have been transmitted from mouth to mouth, a historical memory of our community. And of course, some of the stories we found were quite amazing in some senses, because there are histories where he would say that he was buried under the sea for numerous days, and then he emerged and he was sort of called to this site. And of course, the question was, how does one bring these narratives into the museum? You see, I mean, we would start getting into a question of whether this is fully rational or is this man perfectly all right. But then we sort of found Richard Burton. And in 1851, he had said something quite amazing. He said, the visions appear material to spiritual persons only. The vulgar herd of historians and analysts cannot hope to be so favored by heaven. So again, there is that kind of a rejection, you see, of being unable to access a particular form of knowledge. This is actually the site itself. So what we did was, after we started talking to the caretaker, we also spoke to a student who was finishing up her sociology masters at NUS, and she was not a professional photographer, at least at the time. And we told her to just go around clicking shots, and just to see what happens. And so she would go down and spend a lot of time with the community, taking photographs at the site. So it's not a very elaborate structure, as you can see. It's a very simple site. Of course, this is inside the shrine. And then in April 2010, the site itself ceased to exist because it was torn down for whatever reasons. And one of the things that we did was we went rummaging through the trash bin, literally. And we brought back fragments of the shrine to the museum. Of course, when these things were brought, one of the central pieces of the shrine was this tree, which was said to contain all sorts of healing properties and whatnot. And when we brought it back, it was completely termite infested. And of course, the question was, how are you going to practically bring this into a museum? And we found a way around it. Our conservator is a brilliant chap. And that kind of spurred on the project. So a lot of these images were also presented in the site itself. But in terms of the curation itself, now this is where it became difficult, because we didn't want to simply present these recovered objects, literally from the rubbish bin, in a sort of an ethnographic format. And so curatorially, one had to think of how to use kind of installative methods in presenting an exhibition. So within the site, within this room, within this gallery, there is no curatorial text. It's only filled with objects presented almost as a sort of an art installation. And then you have all these quotations from the people. And of course, the images that the photographer had taken. These are some shots, some images as well. The last image is taken after the shrine was gone. And in many ways, right, then this is something that was crafted as a result of Camping and Tramping and the Sufi and the Bearded Man, which is very much a companion exhibition to the first. Because the Camping and Tramping show talks about the evolution of museology and this notion of how knowledge is produced. And then, of course, the Sufi and the Bearded Man kind of highlights this point at which the museum has somewhat failed in its attempt at trying to engage with this notion of heritage. And this is what was crafted. Please allow me to read. So how dexterous can the University Museum be? Can we be located in these courses and not be too fixated by specific collections and objects? Can we sanction and confuse encounters which might, even for a moment, allow our audiences to touch the void of not knowing? Can we tolerate an awareness, at least as a catalyst for research, of the boundless potentials that lie outside the structures of the ordinary, as opposed to the poetic? Is it possible to reinvent the word empowerment towards the development of skills which allow new information about history and context to be taken in, remembered, and then later deployed independently as active tools? Can the audience notice, wonder, and make connections, shifting from the macro to micro and back again as they look at objects? Which kind of brings me to my last case study, and I'm going to wrap up very soon. This is again, this is another room that we've conceived within the NUS Museum. Just to give you the structure itself, the room is a gallery. It's a very small space, probably a little smaller than this room that we're in today. And the researcher, whoever is engaged, is given three things: a green chalkboard with chalk, a library card, and access to a photocopy machine. And one of the first projects that I at least launched, some of my other colleagues have been developing other stuff as well, was called, and I'm going to talk about that today, it's called In Search of Raffles' Light. Of course, Raffles referring to Stanford Raffles, the founder of Singapore, or at least of modern Singapore. And the prep room here itself, and let me just read a little bit. Conceived as a site for the exploration of curatorial methods in the lead up to various upcoming projects at the museum. The prep room also was consciously and is a fluid, temporary, and dialogic space which invites audiences to encounter and measure the propositional aspects of exhibition making and bring their own perspectives to bear on this inquiry. There were numerous other prep rooms that were launched. Of course, we had this thing called Prince Prep Room, which looked at this modern artist from Singapore who was making woodcuts. And then, of course, one of my other colleagues looked at portraits and the role of portraiture. And she had some interesting reflections here, which I'd like to share with you. We placed a book for visitors to leave their thoughts, received a couple of useful comments, but many were not relevant. Most of the time it was just simply people signing that I was here or something like that. Had prep room discussions with two students. One was a first year undergraduate and another was just about to enter university. In retrospect, she should have given them something simpler and more specific, example looking through newspaper articles. So I think the difficulty that curatorially we started finding was that in many ways we can talk about the archive, but engaging with it is a wholly different idea. But coming back to the case study itself, the Raffles Lighthouse was built in 1854, and it marks the southernmost point of territorial Singapore. And since the 50s, well, I suppose by the 60s, people have not been able to access the site because of strategic reasons. And what we did was that we sort of conceived of a project which began to collect everything related to the Raffles Lighthouse. And so we literally went searching. The idea emerged in conversation with this person here on the screen. He is Dr. Lim Chuan Fong. He is the former head of the Department of Zoology at the Department of Biological, which later became the Department of Biological Sciences. And he approached the museum one day with this kind of a catalog, and it had these shells in it, seashells. And he came up to us and he said that I have a lot of seashells. And I said, but why are you talking to me, you know? And he said, oh, will you deal with natural history? And I said, sure, but he said, but these are not specimens, these are heritage objects. And I said, you know, how can seashells be considered heritage objects? So I said, sure, I'll come down to your place. And so I went down to his place, and he's got a lot of seashells in his house. I couldn't tell the species one from the other, but that's not what I was interested in. When I started looking at his collection and his specimens, I also discovered that he was a photographer in his day. And he had an image of the Raffles Lighthouse taken in the 1950s. And it was a kind of an idyllic image, of the coconut palms, and then you have the kind of lighthouse, and it was taken from a boat a little away from the island. And he told me that he had also been collecting seashells from the site, but had not been able to return back to the site because it had been closed off for all sorts of reasons. Because, the sea lane runs through it, and I suppose there are the strategic reasons for that. So the project began with us simply trying to take Dr. Lim and a group of artists to the Raffles Lighthouse. And of course, in the meantime, we started amassing objects. I invited Fiona Tan. Fiona Tan is somebody who's collaborated with me on numerous occasions, including the Camping and Tramping exhibition, and we continue to work together to sort of see what kinds of traces one could find of this lighthouse that most people had forgotten. And turned out that we found close to 4,000 articles of various sorts. And I'm going to just tell you. So this is how the space is conceived. It's extremely kind of poor in that sense. And we started dividing stuff up into leisure, artifact, and of course it was an important site in the 50s where for this kind of a typical picnic to happen. And of course we started looking at who were the picnickers, and we found that there were a lot of dignitaries who went to the site. There were also numerous digs that happened. People like John Mixick, for instance, the archaeologist I spoke about before, had been digging around the area, and he had found all sorts of stuff. And there was stuff in museum collections. Fiona, all she did was amass stuff. And then we started creating these kinds of, mind maps. This is for everybody to see. People could walk in. And after we had amassed these things, it's one thing to amass materials, right? That's great. But then, of course, the question is, what are you going to do with it? And what we did was we invited, so for instance, we discovered that in the 50s, it was also an important site the school children would be taken for like a day trip. It was so beautiful, I suppose. Of course, the lighthouse also had this laboratory, and different policymakers were coming in. There were also stories like this, sort of big oil spill, cleanup. This is a little later from the 80s. There were all sorts of documentaries made called Green Detectives. This is just everyday ephemera. We even found that some of the older curators from the Raffles Museum were involved in collecting objects from the Raffles Lighthouse. For instance, Eric Alfred was the first non-European director, so he was acting director of the Raffles Museum in the 1950s. Sharks were collected from the Raffles Lighthouse. And of course, there was also this kind of notion of the lighthouse keeper, as he was this romantic site, but he was alone on this island, and this kind of the loneliness of the lighthouse keeper. There were articles and articles and articles talking about how lonely the Raffles lighthouse keepers were. Of course, they got a TV later and whatnot. We even discovered that there's an actual replica. Since we couldn't go to the actual sites, we found that there's a replica of the Raffles lighthouse on the Singapore mainland. So we went and visited it. And this is at a marina. And of course, Fiona kept writing about it and talking about this notion of what the prep room was, because it was kind of engaging with the archive. We don't really still know what it is. But then last year, we decided to take it to a different level. We invited a Singapore artist, filmmaker, national sailor, Charles Lim, to work with us on the project. And of course, Charles's work as a contemporary artist looks at, in a very prolific and extremely nuanced manner, the notion of seascapes and how, this notion of Singapore kind of changes all the time, and how territories change in Singapore, and this kind of constant reclamation and things like that. And we sort of presented him with all these articles in the space, and he started responding. So we started wondering where did a lot of these objects that people like Eric Alfred, I told you, the earlier curator, the stuff that he was collecting, where did it all go? And we discovered, for instance, that in Singapore, the Maritime Port Authority used to run a museum. The Maritime Port Authority, as its name suggests, is the Port Authority of Singapore. And we managed to get in touch with one of the hydrographers, who also turned up in our finds. And we located the old freshener of the Raffles Lighthouse. We started finding all sorts of ephemera. We found old lighthouse models, and these kind of, this, for instance, is still functioning. It's made out of styrofoam. And of course, we also had, in the meantime, found all these archival traces. For instance, when the Raffles Lighthouse was announced, it was on the 35th anniversary of Singapore's founding, And here it says, a lighthouse named Raffles, a toast to free trade and leftovers for the lunatics. So, there was this kind of a lunacy as well that went with this kind of a project. And we found all sorts of hydrographical equipment and things like that somehow may form part of a certain visual landscape of charting and understanding Singapore. There's all sorts of understandings and, I suppose, inflections of the Raffles Lighthouse. This is an old map also that we found. You can see the Raffles Lighthouse is the only one that's animated with palm trees, so it's really a very beautiful site.
Right.
It's right at the bottom here. Yeah. So you see this notion of Singapore and how is it evolving through different mediums. We also went down to the old Navy Museum and started finding again, these lamps and this notion of what it means to create a safer sea, and how does this relate to the nation, and what does this mean about Singapore in many ways. We found people who had actually killed sharks. This is one of the old Navy personnel from the 80s. This is in Singapore actually, and this is somebody who had sketched the Rizal Monument at the Raffles Lighthouse, which is interesting. It's a kind of a notebook done by a national serviceman. And so today I want to end with 5 propositions. 5 propositions that I had written at different points in the evolution of the prep room. So 2 more minutes and I'm done. So please bear with me. When curators deploy objects, both from the contemporary present and the past, they need to find a balance between the kinds of authorial and consumption regimes that the object is set to potentiate. In recent times, however, curators have also deployed newer technologies, frames, and approaches, at times incurring the wrath of critics about the decontextualization or displacement of original authenticities. This room, the prep room, it is intended will dig, asking if to even broach authenticity in a world pulled apart by self-proliferating technologies is an impossible task. Point 2. No matter what kinds of texts are mobilized in the lead-up to the various expositions, each image and the imaginative eyes that will come to seize it will form a point of ordinance in the universe of those who would encounter the space, but also of those who play a direct role in the accumulation and ordering. Perhaps it also appeals to the very basis of the room as a site that simultaneously accommodates and resists the verbal, visual, and emotional, but persists on it being accumulated. Well, it might as well be all these things. Each participant, all the people that we engage, from archaeologists to historians to whoever, to natural scientists, will be constantly reminded that it is not purely in the elements, but in their coming together at a particular moment that the magical sort of potency lies. Well, as the room evolves, with objects and discursive traces being constantly added to it, the hope is to engage the notion of self-reflexivity. I'm not going to repeat this because I repeated it earlier. However, the room should also move from a socio-historical curiosity of phenomenology to offer elements that permit both written narratives of art history and the multisensorial ones of the museum to be recovered in the form of an exposé that evokes a dialogue between its readers, who in turn participate in the recreation of a historical imaginaire from the vantage of the present. And of course, as far as the NUS Museum is concerned, while the NUS Museum's overall programming efforts unfold, the prep room as an initiative goes or does not attempt to be the norm, but rather the resistance and a kind of penchant curiosity in relation to Guggenheim-like encyclopedic initiatives of globalization, as well as to conformism with the inertia that stereotypically affects state cultural institutions. Thus, based on the assumption that art operates as a vehicle for critical reflection, drawing on a whole set of interdisciplinary energies, the room allows the museum to negotiate a distinct position, at once located between the university and the museum, and the other conviction of curation as a site of theoretical exploration and experimentation in its own right, where the overwhelming dominance of the written and the verbal form a primary characteristic of the modern academy, makes way to a primacy of spatial, visual, and sensorial signification. Thank you. This is another one of the things we found when we were searching for our students.
Thank you for coming. As said in the earlier introduction, the second part will take place at Parasite at 8. The screen.
If you have time, should I have 5 minutes for any urgent
Okay.
questions?
Is there any question? Quick question?
Thank you for your presentation and for the introduction of the activities that you pursued in NUS. I find it very theoretically enriching as well as ambitious from a curatorial perspective. My name is Alma. I'm from Hong Kong. You're from the Fine Art Department, and I guess my question relates to my institutional position. You talked about individuals who are working at that you collaborate with from the university. And I was curious about your relationship to, well, the university. Are there any sort of collaboration between departments of the university in relationship to these interesting curatorial efforts that you're presenting? Are there classes that are being, taught in relationship to the work that you're doing?
Can I just, if I could just add another add-on, because in the beginning when you were introducing what you were going to talk about, somewhere in a lot of the verbiage on there was the word publics. And I think just when you were talking about how you interact with the university, this is quite a challenging program, and it asks a lot of any public to engage with it. And I wanted to understand, how are you helping the publics develop for this kind of engagement?
I think they're both kind of related questions. And when it comes to NUS, of course, officially we do not have an art history program, but we have a sort of art museum, right? And so there has been this kind of a difficulty in reconciling the existence of the museum itself when it's not instantly servicing a program. And one of the strategies that we have developed over the years in terms of engaging with faculty is that we have sort of started looking at things, I suppose, a little beyond simply what we may call the realm of art history, but maybe sort of the social history of art. And this allows for all sorts of different energies to converge, and as I said earlier, right, I mean, the engagements range across a number of fields. For instance, you have archaeologists who can use this space.
She's amazing.
Okay, we need this because of the camera.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Chini, Curator Parasite. We're very happy to welcome Mustafa here again as our resident for the Parasite International Art Residency Program. This is the first year and the first time that Parasite has ever started with a residency program, and it is in our hope to kind of create a platform for research in the region and also bring new knowledges to share or to generate new knowledges through thinkers, writers, curators, and sometimes artists. And I think some of you have really been here in the previous presentations that we had by Claire Bishop, by Kunjin Kim. And so today we have our resident for this month, Shabbir Hussain Mustafa, to present on a platform that he's currently working on called the Malaya Black and White. Just a bit of context to it, the notion of the Malaya is actually the combination of Malaysia and Singapore prior to independence. This was at a point in time when they were self-governing, and it was also known as a time where there was a very strong flourishing film industry in the area. Like you're talking the Cathay brothers, the Cathay industry, the Shaw brothers, and so on. And this was also the time where you had people like P. Ramlee, who created a lot of his films that later that was made out of a very huge, created a huge genre of like Pontianak horror films, and that later you see like in the last couple of years adapted by Ming Wong in his formulaic stories. So for now, I'm going to pass this over to Mustafa to talk more about this platform itself, and without further ado, Mustafa.
Thank you for joining me again. It's really brave of you guys. No, but coming back to this, I won't speak for long, just a few minutes. I want to explain, or at least talk about what Malaya Black and White is, and the films that we'll be watching today. Malaya Black and White actually started when we launched Camping and Tramping 2 years ago. It was one of the other projects that was also envisioned sort of in conjunction with the exhibition. And of course, this was not apparent right from the outset, but one of the things that occurred, and as Jimmy just mentioned earlier, was there was a flourishing of the film industry in Singapore. There was also this other aspect in the moving image archives that had been not looked at, both in terms of the literature but also in terms of the kinds of materials that were available. The first film that I will talk a little bit about today was called the Malayan University, which was when the University of Malaya itself was established. And I found a copy of it, just rushes of the film from the original 16mm film footage in the NUS library, because one of the professors actually had ordered it from the British Empire and Colonial Museum to charge the materials. But apart from that, not much was available until about 2010, when a lot of the films started coming online, mostly with regards to the Malayan film. And I'll talk a little bit about what the Malayan film was, but I can also talk about how I encountered it. A lot of it involved Google and Google searches, and they became accessible from around September 2010, when a lot of the films were sort of digitized as part of the colonial film moving images of the British Empire project. This is kind of a massive project across a series of institutions in the UK. And a lot of the funding, of course, came from the arts and humanities grant. And it ran until September 2010. I think initially there were plans to have conferences and whatnot, and I'm still trying to retrace what exactly happened. But coming back to Malaya Black and White, it unfolds in two forms. The first, of course, is a kind of an online platform where we simply use like WordPress, which is free, and we set up this kind of a skeleton. And as many of you would have already read, it's a little experimental in a sense where the idea is that whilst it's Malaya, and as Jimmy has already explained what Malaya means as a category, the idea is eventually to not restrict it to the geographical or the territorial idea of Malaya. So, I mean, for instance, eventually we'll sort of start spanning and going into, for instance, India, Africa, and wherever, I mean, there could even be a page from Hong Kong, for instance. There are numerous films which were sort of released as part of the program I mentioned earlier. But for the moment, of course, what we have are some pages here. Of course, film noir was an interesting kind of a genre that emerged, and we kind of play with it. We call it film noir, which is film, of course, in Malay, talking about how categories become tropicalized, I suppose. We also managed to talk to a friend who is now doing his studies at NYU in film, and he had written his thesis, his honors thesis on this, on all the films that were censored in colonial Singapore. and it was quite interesting, the kinds of findings that he had. And of course, you're free to go and look at these things. Today, of course, we'll be looking at Throes of Empire, but there are numerous other pages here. For instance, Malaya Undead, which looks at this notion of the Orang Minya, which is a oily man. There's this figure of the oily man who keeps recurring in films, and he kind of locates this man and how he's represented in films. Wild Wild East, Nanyang Fever, which looks at the lesser known films produced, of course, by the Japanese during the occupation years and so forth. And the Savage Civilization, which is, it's actually online, you can watch all the films there. It's a series of, it's a 9-part documentary developed by the man whose biography is, of course, some call him the barefoot anthropologist, but his biography was called The Most Offending Soul Alive. He was the late Tom Harrison, who was the curator of the Sarawak Museum. And it's an amazing life. One ought to look at films as well, which are kind of a reflection of it. But today's session is Throes of Empire. These were a series of films that were made by the Malayan Film Unit, mostly starting from 1950, but 1948 was an interesting moment because Malaya was also experiencing some amount of agitation in terms of the leftist parties, and film somehow was seen as an impressive medium in terms of being able to educate the masses, and this notion of being able to develop the propaganda, of course, which led to the creation of the Malayan Film Unit, which emerged initially out of the Crown Film Unit. I'm not going to bore you with the history, just Google for it. But we'll be looking at a number of films. I'm not going to introduce them because they are meant to be experienced, partly because of this. In 1950, the chief producer of the Australian National Film Board arrived and came to Malaya and gave his recommendations. He was commissioned basically to talk about and review the work of the Malayan Film Unit. And this was in the backdrop of the Malayan emergency, which was kind of this movement to quell the communist insurgency that was taking over the region. And I'm going to quote him here. Open quote. Films chosen or produced for this purpose will lose their effect if they are to be obviously propagandist. They should aim without being blatant or familiarizing as many people as they can with positive advantages of democratic government and with the strength and positive achievements of the British Commonwealth. They must be screened regularly and constantly, one after another with no definite intervals, so that their effect is cumulative. And in many ways, a lot of these films kind of reflect that, and it's become an amazing sort of a palimpsest of the region in the 50s. It kind of forms a narrative of its own. The films that I'm going to show you today are the ones that are online, so I've simply picked them off weekend, which is accessible to everybody. So here goes. They are a little long, so we'll be going on for a little over an hour, but if you have questions along the way, I'd be very happy to take them. So.
Just in case you need to take a break, there is some water at the back. We have a water machine, and the bathroom is downstairs at the end of the exhibition.
And this is the first film that was made. It was called Once Is a Play, which is 48, and kind of is a defining film in presenting the four major communities of colonial Malaya, which were the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians, and of course the Europeans and the British. Each community is presented in a certain way, you will notice. This was coming out of Kuala Lumpur. And out of care, of course, certain groups were presented as a lot more easygoing, and some other groups were sort of presented as a lot more politically conscious. But the stuff that came out of Singapore simultaneously was quite different, and I want to show you this, and then yeah, we've got about 20 minutes. I think we can watch 2 more films. And this is a later film in 1957, but it's quite indicative of how the British saw themselves returning and then creating a certain idea, which was clearly that there was an emergency going on, the Malayan emergency, but at the same time, the film somehow showed this kind of a very happy Malaya. Also, the logo, the leaping tiger, appeared in 1951. So, just to know, the earlier one didn't have it because the Malayan film unit itself was not conceived as such. City, the Olive City. This is 1957, so I mean, it's something to think about. But once all this was going on, the films, which are clearly very propagandistic, were trying to sort of highlight this image of Malaya that was in peace and was thriving and was just this serene place. No? But something else was happening, see, in the period. I mean, of course, the emergency was on, and there was an insurgency that was going on, and films were made in the background. So what we'll do now, since we are a little rushed for time, is I'm going to show you 2 films. So we should be finishing up in about 20 minutes. This is Alien Orders, which kind of talks about this idea of the communist threat, and then, of course, how everything ends up in 1955. So. There's one more film that I want to show you, but if you're tired, I can end here as well. I mean, it's, the point that I'm trying to say is that there's a certain story involving it. You don't even need to narrate the history. It's kind of there.
Yes.
Would you like one more? Okay. There are numerous other ones, like for instance this notion of the squatter resettlement. These are all the technologies that were used in fighting the communist threat. You have this, which is the knife. It kind of narrates the story of people going to the jungle and sort of. But this, I think, is the kind of turning point, both in terms of the aesthetics that the film adopts, but also in terms of the kinds of historical exigencies that were presented. And it's 15 minutes, but I'll forward through it and we'll try to finish it up in about 10.
So, thank you for hanging on for such a long session. Do we have any questions from the floor? Very short.
within a question, it's just a comment. You said that at the first film that you were showing, that it showed is like, as we've seen in the others, like this narrative of a peaceful multicultural society, but particularly in the first one, it seemed that it could have turned ugly somehow.
Yeah.
No, like this idealized agonism actually seemed to have a lot of antagonisms, and people like actually searching for certain domination, like groups from one another, no? And I guess, yeah, the comment would be like how this tensions between sustaining that agonism, in this case the last ones that we saw was that agonism is sustained by building up another subject, which is the terrorist who will eventually attack and dismantle this idealized society, you know? So building up that fear, you know, and the notion of the people that support that, fight against that, and that threat, you know, is what kept them going, you know? So, very interesting.
And of course, 1948, the first film that we saw, is an interesting moment because the British have just lost India, you see. And there's a lot of soul searching that's happening. And in many ways, there is some amount historically as well that they deny that there is actually an insurgency taking over Malaya until 1950, which is when, of course, the Malayan film unity sort of formalized. So, you know, the antagonisms are already quite apparent, even though it's so obviously propagandistic.
Yeah.
And of course, Malaya itself as a construct in the 50s was precisely that, you see. I mean, they had to create this idea of Malaya, of one where there are these communities, and then, of course, you know, that the state would sort of take over and inherit. And my talk earlier as well, in terms of trying to understand the University of Malaya Art Museum, was something like that, because I mean, you know, it was a difficult period for the region, and of course this man was trying to build up an art museum in this context, and so I think that's probably, yeah. Thank you for that comment. But that's just the background to it.
Any other questions? Just to round up, again, thank you, Mustafa, for this delightful presentation and screening. So our next resident is actually going to be a panelist for